All right, everyone, it's time to get started. I hope you all enjoyed the quiet time at the very beginning. Maybe next time we'll have some music. But today, we'll bask in the silence, but we're getting started now. So welcome. And thank you for joining us for the 2022 webinar, GIA's annual report on arts and culture. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. And as we begin another year together, this is our first webinar of the year, we are so glad to share the latest edition of GIA's annual Funder Snapshot, which includes Foundation Grants to Arts and Culture 2019, based on the most recent completed year of candid data, and public funding for the arts 2021, prepared by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, or NASA. And with the research and help of our guests today, we're going to look at how things have changed since our last GIA Funder Snapshot, which took place 1 year ago. And we'll see what we can look forward to for 2022. So I am glad to introduce Reina Mukai, Data Services Manager for Global Projects and Partnerships at Candid, Ryan Stubbs, Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and Moja Rhodes, Research Manager at National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. I'll give you a little bit of background on each of them. So Reina Mukai joined the research staff of Candid, which was formerly known as Foundation Center, if you're familiar, in 2006. And she's the Data Services Manager of Global Projects and Partnerships at Candid, as I just mentioned. And in this role, she works on a range of research and data-driven projects. Ryan Stubbs is the Senior Director of Research for NASA. He oversees data collection and research services, and in this role, he directs NASA's tracking of public funding for the arts and its work as the National Repository of State Arts Agency grant-making data. And Moja Rhodes joined NASA in 2021 as the research manager, and she plays an important role in building evidence supporting the arts and state arts agencies through the collection, analysis, and communication of data. And she has extensive experience in planning, research, and policy. And we're so glad to have them all joining us today. At the very end of the presentation, I will come back on to facilitate a Q&A with our presenters. And with that, I will turn it over to them. So yes, oh, thank you for that, Steve. If you want to take a look at this slide here, you can look at how to submit your questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You just click that, enter your question, and I will direct it to the presenters. And if you would like captions, we should have that box toward the bottom. I'm not seeing it right now, Steve, but we will be providing a transcript after. Oh, there it is. There we go. It's here now. Just had to expand my box. So you can go ahead and click that and show subtitles. So with that, I will now turn it over to our presenters, and I will kick it over to you, Reina, to get us started.
Hi, everyone. And thank you to GIA for organizing this webinar and inviting me to participate again this year. So my presentation today is going to focus on trends in foundation funding for arts and culture among a set of the largest US foundations over the last decade. And we're going to be looking at how arts funding has fared compared to overall giving. Look at the breakdown of funding to various arts subcategories, along with arts funding by population served, specifically for Alana communities. And lastly, look at what we know about COVID-19 and how it has impacted philanthropy and the arts and culture sector. So before jumping into findings, I wanted to provide an overview of our grant sample that much of this data that I'm presenting is based on. So the set includes all grants of $10,000 or more awarded by the roughly 1,000 largest US foundations by total giving. And it accounts for about 2/5 of all foundation giving by US-based private and community foundations. The 2019 grant sample includes 152,000 grants totaling $35.9 billion, of which arts and culture accounted for about 16,000 grants totaling $2.5 billion. This figure shows the share of dollars going to arts and culture between 2009 and 2019. Over the past decade, US foundation funding supporting arts and culture has slowly declined as a share of total foundation giving. At its peak in 2010, arts funding accounted for about 11% of overall dollars. And for the 5 years following that peak, the share of arts funding had hovered around 8 or 9%. However, this year, arts funding accounted for about 7% of overall dollars. The share of number of grants has also declined, but has remained more or less steady for the last several years at about 11%. But even given the slight decline in the share of dollars, arts and culture still remains one of the top priority areas for funders. This next figure represents the actual dollar amounts awarded for arts and culture by our set of the largest US foundations. And you can see that before 2015, giving for arts had remained relatively steady at about 2.3, 2.5 billion, not accounting for inflation. And in 2018 went up to 3 billion. But in this most recent year, arts funding was back down to 2.5 billion. There's always large grants included in our sets, although compared to 2018, the number of exceptionally large grants declined for this most recent set for 2019. In 2018, there were 71 grants of 5 million or more, totaling 800 million, while in 2019, there were 52 grants of 5 million or more, totaling about 500 million. The median art grants has also been getting higher the last several years. Prior to 2015, the median grant amount for arts and culture had remained consistent at about 25,000 since the early 1990s. But for the most recent year, the median art grant was 30,000. This next figure represents the change in foundation giving by a matched set of funders between 2018 and 2019. So among a matched subset of 705 funders, grant dollars for the arts was down 10% compared to a 7% increase in grant dollars overall. The change in number of grants was also down 7% for arts and culture and down 2% for all giving. Multidisciplinary arts and museums saw the highest decrease in funding between 2018 and 2019 based on a matched set of funders, while historical activities saw the highest growth. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the distribution of arts funding by field. So performing arts, which includes everything from dance to theater, music, and performing arts education, captured the largest share of arts funding in 2019, accounting for about 32% of all arts dollars, or 806 million. Among the largest performing arts grants in the latest sample was a $55 million grant from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation to Philadelphia Orchestra Associations. Museums captured the second largest share of dollars in 2019, accounting for 24% of all arts dollars, or 604 million. So in any given year, these two fields capture the largest share of arts funding, often alternating from year to year. So next, I'm going to talk about the distribution of arts funding by types of support. This figure shows the breakdown of giving to arts by support strategy. Program, general operating, and capital support accounted for the largest share of grant dollars supporting the arts. Program support received the largest share of arts grant dollars in 2019, capturing 31% of arts dollars and also 31% of the number of grants. Special programs and projects typically receive one of the largest share of arts and culture dollars. And the same is true in most of the other major fields like health, education, where program support consistently accounts for one of the largest shares of funding. General operating support received the second largest share of arts grant dollars. The shares of grant dollars and number of grants allocated for the support strategy in 2019 were higher for arts and culture than the overall share directed to general operating support, which accounted for 20% for grant dollars and 22% for the number of grants. The beneficiaries of large general support dollars tend to be large, well-established art museums and performing arts centers. Capital support accounted for the third largest share of arts grant dollars. So similar to general support, the share of grant dollars allocated for this type of support was also higher for arts and culture than for grants overall. Grants for capital support tend to be larger on average than awards for program and general operating support. And exceptionally large capital grants can have a pretty significant effect on the distribution of funding by support strategy. The median grant amount for capital support in 2019 was $50,000 versus $30,000 for program and general operating support. Some of the largest art grants in 2019 were for endowments, collections, buildings and renovations, all of which would be included under capital support. So next I'm going to talk about arts funding to Alana communities. This is an analysis that we include in the Arts Snapshot, but there is interest around tracking funding by population serve, and so we've included some of that information to share for today's webinar. So this figure shows the share of arts funding allocated for Alana communities between 2009 and 2019. So over the past decade, arts funding for Alana communities looks like it's held steady at around 5 or 6%. But for the last 3 years of available data, we see like a steady increase. So in 2017 and 2018, the share of arts funding was 9%. And in 2019, it was 10%. The share of number of grants to Alana communities has also steadily increased in the last 3 years. In 2019, the share of number of grants to Alana communities was 11%. People of African descent and Indigenous peoples were the largest recipients of funding by Alana communities the last few years. And this has largely to do with many of the larger grants being awarded to major cultural institutions associated with these population groups. So if this analysis included those types of grants, the shares would likely be lower. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what we know about funders and how they're responding to COVID-19. So Candid began tracking funding for COVID-19 back in February 2020. To get this data, we were initially looking at public announcements and press releases, as well as some early e-reported data. So these are e-reporters and funders that report their grants data directly to Candid. And more recently, we've expanded our search by looking at more websites and news sources. As of February this year, we had close to 73,000 grants totaling $27.3 billion for COVID-19 related funding. This isn't just for arts, but this is overall in our database. Mackenzie Scott and Google's corporate giving program were top funders.
Raina, before you continue, you made reference to Alana. Do you want to unpack what that acronym stands for, just so that folks can stay with you? Oh, I can as well.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was kind of a term that GIA used.
Yeah.
For us, we capture it by our population served coding. So it's any grant awarded to grants explicitly awarded to a specific ethnic racial minority, not including Caucasians.
That's right.
How we capture it.
That's right. And to add a little bit more, just so folks in our community know, the actual letters of the acronym ALANA stands for African People of African, Latinx, Arab, Asian, or Native American descent. So when you hear us talk about ALANA, that is the community those are the communities that we're talking about. So I'll kick it back over to you, Rain. I just want to make sure everyone can keep up.
Okay, thanks, Sherilyn. I didn't see that come up in the chat. So, yes. So, okay, this map. So the data that we collect feeds this interactive, like publicly available funding map, which enables users to filter data in various ways, including location of the funder or recipient organization, grant maker type, and subject areas like arts and culture. The totals that we show on this map include both pledges, so promises of future funding, and grants awarded. So there is some double counting within this data. And the data is not comprehensive by any means, as COVID-19 related funding is still ongoing, and we also don't have access to all grants awarded or announced, but it's a good tool to track the funding that we do know about. And the map is refreshed regularly, so we have new data coming in. And it is publicly available, so anyone can access it. The majority of funding in the map is from corporations and community foundations. So corporations account for a big portion of the dollars awarded for COVID-19 related funding. This includes in-kind gifts with cash value, as well as cash donations. Community foundations have awarded the highest number of grants, accounting for close to 40% of the number of grants awarded. Though community foundations aren't necessarily giving the largest grants, they play an important role in understanding the local context and giving to community-based organizations. Many of the awards often lack details about where funding is ultimately going. So roughly half of the funding dollars, including most of the largest funders, went to unknown or multiple recipients. So digging deeper into who's benefiting from this funding, Candid released an updated philanthropy and COVID-19 report last March. The report found that human service organizations received the largest share of funding among awards to specified recipients. This is a change from funding in the first half of 2020, where health and public safety organizations received the most support. Human service organizations, which have been on the front line of the pandemic, include food banks, United Ways, YMCAs, WCAs. Health organizations did rank second, accounting for 26% of dollars. Top health organizations included Gavi, which is an international organization created to improve access to vaccines in the world's poorest countries, and then COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator, a philanthropic collaboration to help speed up the development of COVID-19 therapeutics. Arts and culture orgs received 1% of COVID funding, so about 72 million, and about 5% of number of grants. This report also found that funding for unrestricted or flexible support dramatically increased. So 39% of dollars and 21% of the gifts to specified recipients were described as unrestricted or flexible. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this last part I wanted to share with you are some findings from a report released by Urban Institute last fall called Nonprofit Trends and Impacts. The report is based on nationally representative survey data. And one of the things it looks at is donation trends to nonprofit organizations from 2015 to 2020, which provide valuable insights into the potential impact of COVID-19. There's a lot of really good information in the report, but I'm just highlighting a few of the findings the report touched on that are related to arts organizations that I thought this group would find interesting. So while all nonprofits were impacted by the events of 2020, arts organizations were impacted more than other sectors, especially the smaller arts organizations. 40% of organizations overall reported losses in total revenue for 2020, while 54% of arts organizations reported losses in total revenue. As far as donations to organizations, all fields, like which include arts, education, health, human services, and nearly all sizes of organizations experienced decreases in donations in 2020. Compared to 2015 to 2019, the share of arts organizations reporting declines in overall donations was 13% versus 43% of arts organizations reporting experiencing declines in donations in 2020. Smaller organizations overall were more likely to experience declines in donations, while larger organizations, so those with expenses of $1 million or more, were less likely to experience declines in donations. So the experiences of arts organizations really varied across size groups. So small arts organizations were hit particularly hard in 2020, whereas greater shares of larger organizations, and this was, I guess, regardless of mission area, experienced smaller declines. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Ryan and Moja to talk about public funding for the arts.
Great, thanks, Raina. Fascinating stuff, as always. Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Stubbs. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and I'm joined by my colleague, Moja Rhodes. And we're happy to be here today to discuss public funding for the arts in 2021. I also wanted to thank our colleague, Nak-Young Rhee, who made many contributions to our article. And our role today is to focus on data trends in public funding and public grant making in the arts. We'll start with the trends published in the GIA Reader. We'll provide updates on FY 2022 funding for states. We'll unpack some information on how the public funding ecosystem works and share some grant making statistics and challenges in collecting data. And with that, I will hand things over to Moja to get us going.
Thank you, Ryan. So, and it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. So when we think about public funding for the arts, it's useful to consider three mechanisms: federal, state, and local. And at the federal level, we are talking about congressional allocations to the National Endowment of Arts, the NEA. At the state level, we are talking about state legislative allocations to state arts agencies, SAAs. And at the local level, we're talking about local allocations to local arts agencies, LAAs. And I will be focusing on fiscal year 2021, when we really feel the weight of the pandemic on state budgets and local budgets that had to make lots of cuts and the ramifications of these cuts on the arts. And then I will touch upon 2022, fiscal year 2022, which brings about some good news. And we have a kind of dramatic rebound at the SAA level. So I will start with the NEA, the National Endowment of Arts. They receive a budget from Congress. And in 2021, the allocation in 2021 met the all-time high in 2010 of 168 million. After 2010, there was a bit of a dip, but soon after, there was a steady increase, and there's been a steady increase even during the pandemic. The picture is not the same for fiscal year 2021. You have to remember, we're not talking about 2022, we're talking about 2021, is different for states' arts agencies. As I said, at this point, we're really feeling the ramifications of the pandemic. And we saw a decrease in 20% overall from 490 million to about 430 million. And it's different from the federal. In that situation, we saw an increase because the federal budgets tend to be a little bit more stable. State budgets do tend to reflect more of the economic situation, less flexibility. And so moving on to local arts agencies, we also see a dip of around 7% from 2020, fiscal year 2020, from 789 million to 740 million. These, I forgot to add that the data from state arts agencies comes from NASA's revenue surveys. We survey our members twice yearly and survey them about the incoming revenues. And we do that twice a year. These data are coming from the Americans for the Arts. And I must note that they're estimates. There's about 4,500 local arts agencies. We survey about 56 states and are able to do that. 4,500 agencies is a very, very hard to survey all of them. So Americans for the Arts surveys a sample of some of the largest local arts agencies. So these numbers are based on a sample. And as I said before, we are seeing a slightly continual drop from the year before, around 7%. So overall, we have seen a 20% drop, amounting to 1.3 billion in public funding for the arts for the year for fiscal year 2021. And while that may seem to be very large, we have to consider that arts tend to be a small portion of federal and state budgets for the National Endowment for the Arts. They represent about 0.004% of the federal budget, and state arts agencies represent on average about 0.05% of states' overall budgets. And interestingly, according to figures from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, arts and cultural productions contribute about 4.5% to GDP. So moving on, COVID-19 and supplemental funding, we've had two large packages, the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. States are continuing to use CARE funds into 2022, and states have now begun to use ARP funds, and will be using that into 2022 and 2023. ARP funds have provided additional endowment funding, and also 350 billion has been dedicated to states to use in discretionary funding. So many states have tapped into these sources to provide emergency relief grants to both individuals and organizations, and also statewide programs. If you'd like to see a full list of state programs, you can visit our 2021 revenues report and our 2022 revenues report on the NASA website. So fiscal year 2022 looking a little bit brighter due to two reasons. First of all, the significant federal pandemic aid. The 350 billion is intended to balance state budgets. So this is buoyed, can't say that word, floated up state budgets. Also the opening of economies. The opening of economies, increases in spending, increases in unemployment have bolstered state budgets. So for 2022, these are data coming from our 2022 state revenues report. We have seen a 104% increase in state allocations, totaling to about $820 million. This is a record all-time high. This is unprecedented, but we do need to caveat this by saying the increase is not even. There have been about 6 states that have received very large one-time multi-year grants, allocations, and they're factoring in a lot of the weight here. But overall, 50 states have received increases. So this increase is unanimous, it's just not proportional. And we also need to consider that in the future, this dramatic increase is most likely not going to continue. Federal pandemic aid may come to an end after ARP, we don't know. But this dramatic increase is a bit of an anomaly, or not an anomaly, it's a bit of a one-time event. Okay, so moving on. NEA forecasts and LAA forecasts. We don't know federal fiscal year 2022 appropriations have not been settled yet. But both the House and the Senate have put forward proposals to increase the NEA's budget by 20%. And we don't have the estimates for the local arts agencies either, but it's likely to trend similar to the states. And we do know that the NEA has dedicated 20 million in ARP funds to LAAs. So let's see, my mouse is not moving. Okay, there we go. So we've only talked about absolute numbers, we've only talked about numbers, but we have to consider these numbers in terms of the inflation, because a dollar today is not the same thing as a dollar yesterday. So what does that mean? That means costs are rising as inflation rises. The cost of doing business is higher, and that puts strains on cultural experiences. So I'm sorry, there was a slide before. Oh, yes. So as we can see here from the inflation adjusted, the inflation adjusted is below each of the bold lines. And as we can see, it does tend to decrease both for SAAs and LAAs. It has been, public funding at the federal level has kept in pace with inflation, but at the state and local level, it has not. And those lighter lines are inflation adjusted numbers. So as a whole, public funding has not kept in pace with inflation. It's been down 31% from 2001 to 2021. That's a 41% decrease for state arts agencies, and that's about a 31% decrease for local arts agencies. The Fed has increased 4.5%. And inflation is especially important to consider given how bad inflation has been for 2021. It's risen dramatically. It's risen higher than it has in the past couple of decades. And this is a trend that we are continuing to see into 2002. So this is an important consideration to keep in mind when we are talking about public funding. And lastly, before I hand it over to Ryan, I will be discussing per capita funding. And this is how funding is divided amongst people. And so as a population grows, so should the funding, how taxpayers, they should be receiving back proportionately. And so this graphic is kind of wonky, it goes up and down. What we can see is that it had been increasing prior to 2021, per capita funding had been increasing, but it is back down again. So now I pass it over to Ryan.
Great, thanks very much, Moja. Moving on. So now that we know the relative levels of funding and these trends, I wanted to talk a little bit about how different levels of government grant makers are interconnected, including the National Endowment for the Arts. So the NEA, state arts agencies, and local arts agencies are all connected with real dollars. But those partnerships and those dollars are matched at every level. And that leverages many more funds and contributes to a system of support for the arts in the United States. States' prominence in this partnership makes the value of the arts and the Arts Endowment highly visible to the public and achieves policy goals. And by congressional mandate, the Arts Endowment allocates 40% of its annual program funding to state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. These funds are distributed in the form of partnership agreements. Partnership agreements support the locally created state arts plans, and each state arts agency redistributes federal dollars in accordance with a constituent-driven state plan, thus ensuring the federal funds respond to the current needs of communities and their local economic, educational, civic, and cultural priorities. And some of these dollars are also regranted by local governments and local arts agencies. Regranting helps support public infrastructure for grant making in the arts and ensures that those closest to the ground are making the funding decisions. Another important part of this diagram is the leadership role that the NEA plays in building the sector in terms of knowledge and programs. Through federal priorities, this leadership filters through every level of government. For example, the NEA catalyzes cross-sector work through programs such as Creative Forces in our town and contributes research to help us understand cross-sector benefits and the value of arts and cultural production. This connectivity of funding and leadership helps different levels of government learn from each other, and that knowledge flows both from the federal to the local levels and from the local to the federal level. This next diagram attempts to explain how public sector investments are operationalized in the broader arts ecosystem. First, public investments in the arts are informed by principles of equity and accountability. Now, the goals of equity and accountability are not easy to obtain. They're a function of consistent work by policymakers, practitioners, and the public. However, public investments are purposed to serve the entirety of a population. Also, public funding allocations are largely transparent in terms of appropriations processes, community input, award allocations, and reporting. And I point this out because it's important to point out that it is within the role of government agencies to consider equity when creating policies and implementing programs. Now, the actors who are implementing the work are shown on the left of the circle. And by actors, I mean those utilizing the funds in general, not actual actors, but actual actors do benefit and receive public funding. But overall, this is where the rubber meets the road. Funds are being received by nonprofit organizations, which are primarily arts organizations, by artists, by institutions, which includes schools, and the broader creative workforce. And to put things very generally, the work occurs through projects, maintaining infrastructure, through operation support, through ongoing programmatic work, and also cross-sector collaborations and other types of collaborations. And I think advancement of the system occurs through leadership and advocacy. So first, advocacy is essential to the growth of resources for public entities. It is simply part of the work for arts advocates to make their case for resources, and that is likely to always be true. And while connected to advocacy, leadership is also necessary for advancing the field and the public sector. This means continuing the betterment of work to reach more people, resonate in more effective ways, and to positively contribute to the civic, educational, and economic benefits of the arts. So just setting a bit of the setting the table for the background of the system, but now I wanted to drill down a little more into what we know about how state arts agencies support local arts agencies in terms of grant making, and offer a few grant making statistics. So using state arts agency data, we can examine grant making trends that describe some of these important relationships. For example, we know that 12% of aggregated state arts agency grant dollars go to local arts agencies. And of those grants, we see that the largest percentage of those dollars, that's 45%, are re-granted at the local level. And a large percentage of these awards also help provide operational support to local arts agencies. So those grants are going both for operating support for local arts agencies and also for local arts agencies to then re-grant those dollars to organizations and artists. And it's notable that nearly half of state arts agency grants going to local arts agencies go to agencies that are located in rural communities. And we know that state funds make up larger portions of smaller local arts agency budgets. So that state and local relationship is especially important in communities that have less cultural infrastructure and resources. I also wanted to point out a few trends regarding state arts agency support for individual artists. Given that the NEA cannot directly fund individual artists outside of a few specified categories, state and local support for individual artists is really important. We know that state arts agencies continue to grow their support for individual artists. Typically, around 11% of state arts agency grant-making budgets go to individual artists, but state support for individual artists has been on the rise. Also, the number of grants in dollars increased significantly between 2016 and 2019, and that was a time period where state arts agency budgets were relatively flat. Also, between 2015 and 2019, state arts agencies allocated over $43 million to individual artists in a variety of disciplines and for a variety of activities. We can see here that larger portions of these funds are for artists to create work. So this includes things like fellowships, performances, readings, exhibitions, and general artwork creation. So of course, artists benefit from funding going to cultural institutions and nonprofits that are for projects and operations. But we also see a trend of growing support for direct support for individual artists, for them to make work and to have the time to make work. Now I wanted to move on and cite a few statistics that speak to the public sector principle of equity. Now, many public investments in the arts are designed to reach underserved communities. And by underserved, we are talking broadly and somewhat vaguely about race, economic status, geography, populations living with disabilities, youth at risk, et cetera. But data indicate that public funders are broadly reaching these goals. For example, 36% of NEA grants reach underserved populations, 64% go to smaller organizations, and that's organizations with budgets under 2 million. We also know that 42% of local arts agencies gather data to understand equity gaps, and 21% of state arts agency grants go to rural places, which is higher than rural population in general. So these statistics are encouraging in some sense, but I also bring them up because they're imperfect. And I think they speak to a field-wide issue of needing better information about who benefits from arts investments and why. Now, I don't have the solution to that issue, but I can speak a little bit to the challenges faced by state arts agencies in collecting these types of data. Now, one way that states collect data on beneficiaries by race and ethnicity is asking grantees to report if a certain population, group of population, benefited from a grant. One way this is useful is that we can see the aggregated beneficiaries by race/ethnicity and compare that to census demographics. And we do see that that beneficiaries by race are in relative percentage ranges of populations for the country as a whole. And that's useful, but there's lots of limitations and challenges here. And so I just wanted to point out a few. So we see large percentages of grantees that are reluctant to report serving specific populations, especially if they view the data as potentially negative to a funder. And I have to imagine that is a similar challenge for public and private grant makers. Also, the data is imprecise and doesn't actually tell us much about advancing equity and practices that organizations may be taking to advance equity. And there's also a real challenge with asking small organizations to report data in general, and a challenge with asking large organizations or those receiving operating support to accurately estimate who benefited from a specific pot of money when they're getting different pots of money from lots of different places. So this is a long-term and ongoing field-wide challenge that I know many of you are thinking about, and there certainly isn't an easy solution, but I'm sure that arts grant makers and researchers are continuing to make progress in this area, and certainly something that NASA continues to think about. Now, one last point that speaks to the relationship between public and private grant makers. This chart shows the number of grants by dollar size for the NEA, foundations, and state arts agencies, and then keeping in mind that this does not include foundation, or this only includes the foundation grants below 10,000. So it's not that those don't exist, they're just not shown in the specific chart. But overall, this reiterates, I think, the fact that public funders focus on a greater number of smaller awards, but it also illustrates how different sectors are serving different needs, and that all players within the cultural funding ecosystem are necessary. And both public and private investments in the arts are necessary to democratize arts experiences for the public in America. All right, and then there's much more information in data on public funding for the arts that you can get through the various websites the information that we talked about today came from National Endowment for the Arts, from NASA, and from Americans for the Arts. And you can see some of those resources in their websites here. And with that, I will hand it over to Sherilyn for questions.
All right. right. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you everyone for your presentations. It is time for the Q&A. You should see the Q&A icon to the bottom of your screen. We've already got some questions queued up. So I will just dive in and keep the questions coming. So Ryan, when you were presenting the slide with the breakdown of grants going towards Alana communities, someone asked, does the data for underserved communities or Alana communities only include LAA and SAA support? Where do RAO grants exist in the data? Is that something you can respond to?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously we have much more data on state arts agencies as NASA. So state arts agencies have final descriptive reports for that should encompass the totality of their grant making activities, and that goes to NEA and to NASA as part of their partnership agreement. So the data there does give us the information about how grantees are reporting serving different beneficiaries. That also includes regional arts organization data. I believe in the slide that I showed, we were just looking at SAAs, but RAOs do also report that information. There's a number of resources, and I think a fairly recent resource from Americans for the Arts that looks at local arts agency practices related to equity and the distribution of funds. So that is available on the Americans for the Arts website, though it doesn't get into the same level of detail. Obviously, there are data challenges around how we standardize or don't standardize collecting these different things across different institutions, but the state arts agency data and the regional arts organization data is standardized, so we can.
That's great, thank you. I'm gonna come back to you, Ryan and Moja. I've got some more audience questions for you. But before that, I'm gonna actually jump over to you, Raina, and ask you a question here. So someone was wondering about the arts and culture grant coding and whether it's likely that funding not coded in the arts and culture data that you've presented is coming into other sector categories like community development, health, climate change, housing, etc.
So we actually did switch sort of the strategy. I think it was about 5 years ago or maybe 4 years ago, where we are now capturing grants that also have other coding. So previously we were relying on what we called primary subject coding. So for example, if a grant had a primary subject of arts, those were the only grants that were being included in our analysis. But now we include any grant that has arts coding. So it can have multiple subject codes. So it can have, let's say like there's a grant awarded to a youth development group. And it may have some human services types of subject codes along with arts codes. Let's say it's for like art therapy or like therapy through art or something like that. So those types of grants are also coming into the set. And so if you're looking at like an overall chart to see like how, the distribution of grants by subject area, there may be some double counting. They're not exclusive. So an arts grant that's being counted toward arts may also be counted toward human services if a grant had subject coding for both.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. And before I kick it back over to Ryan and Moja, someone just asked about the year. I know we typically at Grantmakers in the Arts, we kind of go year by year by year. And this person is very excited about the 2020 and 2021 data. So can you just offer anything that they can look out for now? Anything that's currently available or that will be available soon that folks can access?
Right. I mean, we really just closed, let's say like a complete year for this analysis that we do for GIA, the Art Snapshot. We're really looking at a complete year of grants data, right. Which is 2019. But we obviously have grants, authorized or paid in 2020 and 2021 in our database that is accessible through, like the COVID-19 map I showed or through some of our subscription tools. It just doesn't provide a full view. And so we don't provide analysis on it for this report, but you can access it. You just have to keep in mind that, grants collection is ongoing.
Yes, that's great. Thank you for that. So going back over to you, Ryan and Moja, some folks want to get a better understanding of, when we say large organizations or small organizations, what do we really mean? So can you just give a little bit more information about what it means? Like, how are you defining large organizations or small organizations in the data?
Sure. So, I mean, one thing that referenced in the presentation that I believe we're looking at small and medium organizations at under $2 million. And I believe that it was for citing grants from the NEA. I think there's a lot of ways to look at this. I think in the grant making data that we presented, we weren't necessarily doing budget breakdowns, but we know that a large number of organizations receiving funding from state arts agencies have budgets that are below 1 million and often much smaller. For example, the median grant award for state arts agencies, I believe, is $4,500, so $4,500. So these are a lot of smaller awards going to smaller organizations. We of course look at this on a continuum, just depending how we want to do the breakdown. But hopefully that is a little bit helpful.
Yeah. I would say it. I mean, it wasn't my question, but I'm going to go ahead and say it was. Hopefully, feel free to keep, follow-up questions coming. And I still want to stay with you, Ryan and Moja. Someone else was asking about the state agency funds and wanted to know how much of the funds go to overhead themselves versus, other parts of an organization's budget. And is that something that they can access on the website, or is there a way to kind of break that down a little bit further?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that you could get some sense of that by looking at grant making budgets versus total revenues, right? So that gives you a little part of the overall picture. So those are figures that we do publish. You can go to our website. We have a funding section and a grant making section. And so looking at the fiscal years of the appropriations data versus the fiscal years of the grant making data tells one part of that story, but it really just tells the dollars that are going to grant making, because it's not just grant making that those allocations are going through. So there are many programmatic non-grant activities that state arts agencies do. For example, business training for artists, for example, community development work, and technical assistance. So it's hard to get that breakdown completely. But I would say that if you want to at least look at grant making budgets versus total allocations, that you can look at some of those figures on our website. But it's hard to say a certain percentage.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for that. So Raina, have you seen any changes in foundation behavior or funding practices or patterns since COVID-19? And I mean, I feel like we're still in COVID-19. I'm like, are we ever not going to be in COVID-19 anymore? But just kind of what have you seen since, 2020, people kind of responded immediately, and how do you think things will be trending in the coming years?
So, I mean, like you said, we're still, collecting data on 2020. We're still, in the pandemic. And so we don't have concrete or, comprehensive data. So we don't have a complete picture of the trends. But there have been some interesting surveys and reports released that address these kinds of questions. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the findings from the philanthropy and COVID-19 report found that funding for unrestricted and flexible support has really increased significantly. And there have been other reports. I think there was one from, maybe it was last year or the year before, from the Center for Effective Philanthropy that reported similar findings. So I think that there has been more generally a push toward more flexible funding and just trust between grant makers and grantees. And I think that is actually one of the results of the pandemic, and hopefully something that continues.
That's great. Thank you. And kind of staying in the same space of, looking at trends and thinking about the future, Ryan and Moja, can you make any predictions about how government support for the arts will trend over the next few years?
I'm happy to give that a shot if you like, Moja. Sure. Well, basically, I would say that we're in a very interesting time, right? Where we're seeing this large infusion of dollars into state budgets due to various economic relief factors and programs coming from the federal level, given economic trends at the state and local level. And I would say that we're very cautious about how things will trend. We certainly would expect, given the nature of the funding that occurred in this current year, especially at the state level, for that to scale back in the next year, just because there won't be that same level of resources. However, I think we also want to positively say that we think state arts agencies and public arts agencies, overall locals and the NEA, have shown themselves to be great stewards of funds in recovery efforts, and that there's been a great effectiveness to the investments in the arts that have gone to create jobs, support infrastructure, support cultural infrastructure, keep the doors open of all of these organizations across the country. And I think people realize that that is important to both economic recovery and for getting society back to where I won't say back to normal, but back on track. And so I would say that the demonstration of the value of those investments will pay forward in future years. But there are going to be continuing stresses on state budgets from a variety of sectors. And so we have to remain vigilant.
That's great. Thank you. Moja, did you want to add to that, or do you feel like we've covered it?
I feel like that was a good gist. Yeah, we're not going to see the same increases by any means, I think, in the next couple of years. But yeah, I mean, I think that was a very good cap.
Okay, great. Awesome. Ryan, I'm not sure, I'm seeing some things here on the back end. I'm gonna keep going through some of these questions, but do you want to unmute and address anything, or you're okay? Awesome. So actually, this next question is actually still for you both, Moja and Ryan. So can you talk about the difference between grants made to arts production per se? So I'm thinking, performance and all of those things versus or theater, visual arts, versus arts education, including within schools. There's anything you can.
Sure. I can talk a little bit about that. And I would also say that we have lots of great resources on this on our website. So on nasa-arts.org, under research, there are lots of resources on grant making. And we do have some grant making fact sheets, which have been updated fairly recently. This is still looking at data from FY19, so it's a little bit older now, but these are updated as more data comes in. But we do have information, and the data that is based on the final descriptive reports that state arts agencies are submitting, which describes all of their grant making, does allow us to show investments in arts education versus local arts agencies versus operating support versus grants to rural areas. So there's lots of in-depth things that you can do, but looking at the data that we have, but I can say that 25% of all grant dollars of total grants awarded by state arts agencies are primarily for arts education. So it's a large percentage of the grant making that state arts agencies do for arts education. We can also break that down by institution and where those are going. So a large percentage of those, 70% are going to arts organizations, right? So those are arts education dollars that are going to arts, arts organizations, and then about 11% go to education institutions. So a good percentage as well are going directly to schools. But then again, arts education programming might be implemented by an organization that's working with a school, either in school or out of school. So it's a little hard to break all of that down, but we do have some data that talks about it.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan. Before we go, want to just open it up if you have any final thoughts. I saw one question in our Q&A, which I thought was great. And I think that would be like a whole nother webinar, but how do we make this data actionable? And I know you're very much focused on the research and like presenting the facts of what we have. But if you have, any final thoughts, or, you have any thoughts about how, we might make the data actionable, I know that I'll definitely say and I think in terms of, Alana communities specifically, that's something we talk about a lot, and how much funding is not going in that direction. Just thinking about, okay, just knowing what's happening in the funding sector and where dollars are or aren't going, just thinking, okay, this is what I can expect. This is what I can advocate for. This is what I can lobby for. Those are the things that come up for me in terms of next step actions. But if you have anything you want to add to that, Ryan, Raina, and Moja, about next steps or final words before we hop off.
Raina, would you like? Okay. I'll try to be brief. Yeah, that could be an entire entire other webinar, but really good and thoughtful question. I would say that, part of this, the data is here to inform decision makers and policymakers, right? And so the better data that we can have, the more accurate data that we have, the more useful information, that's going to be useful for policymakers, which includes people that are doing the work, grant makers in the arts grant makers, all of you, when implementing your policies to reflect more equitable grant making, or taking actions that will hopefully get to the outcomes that we're all looking to get at. I would say that the data is really informative. Of course, like on the aggregate level, on the national level, we see some trends, but I think also when we're talking about individual grant makers or individual states, the data that is about their communities or about their states is going to be the most important to try and understand policy changes. And so I would say that the data is here, it's informative, but there's another part of the process, which is just using the data and taking data-driven actions to inform new or change grant-making policies.
Thanks, Ryan. Moja, Raina, anything to add?
Data can always engender discussions that need to be had. And so I think it can be wisely used for advocacy discussions in general.
Thank you, Moja. Raina, final words?
Nothing for me, though. I think that's a great question. And one thing I will just plug for our organization is, we have something that we call the Profile Updater Program. And now, there's been a lot of interest in, who's leading organizations, especially around BIPOC-led arts organizations or organizations in general. And through this Profile Updater Program, where organizations are able to self-report their demographic data on their staff and board. And, we're working with membership organizations and funders to encourage their members, and it's really valuable information. And so if you want to learn more about it, yes, I see my email down right there. So please do email me and we can talk more.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for your fantastic presentations. As you can see on the screen, their email addresses are there for some of the questions we didn't get to, or if you got more questions that you want to ask them, the contact is there. We'll be sending out a PDF and a recording of the slides. And, you know, kind of continuing on with this conversation about, well, how can we make this data actionable? Stay tuned. On March 15th, we're having an advocacy and lobbying webinar, so we can learn how we can continue to make data actionable, so that it's not just numbers, but it becomes action, and we can see communities change, and we can reimagine the future and the present that we're in right now. So with that said, thank you all so much for coming. We're so glad that you were here. We hope you got a lot out of it. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Sherilyn Seely, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks all.
you.